You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. Misinformation movements on the internet like QAnon present trouble for foreign governments and institutions across the world. Conspiracy theories originating in online chat rooms are gaining steam and escalating violence, even in countries that have long been cast as models of political stability. On December 7th, 2022, police arrested 25 people accused of planning to overthrow the German government. Among those arrested were members of the Reichsbürger, a far-right German movement that believes the government is illegitimate. Groups like the Reichsbürgers are certainly not new, but the ways that they radicalize and embrace each other's extremist networks on the internet are new. Julia Ebner leads the Violent Extremism Lab at the University of Oxford and spent years infiltrating online extremist networks for her 2019 book, Going Dark: The Secret Lives of Extremists. When she was last on the program, Julia told me just how deep the rabbit hole goes. In your research for your book, Going Dark, you infiltrated extremist groups. How did you do it, and what did you learn?
I spent several months setting up avatar identities online, first of all. So I could be recruited into different types of far-right extremist movements. I also joined some jihadist movements because I really wanted to learn more about the human drivers. What motivates people who join extremist movements and why do they stay there? And I was then, by some movements, invited to also join them offline. For example, Generation Identity in the UK had a meeting in an Airbnb and one meeting in a pub that I joined. I also went to a neo-Nazi festival on the German-Polish border and joined several other meetings, also live in person. And it did help me to get a better understanding of how they operate, how their tactics work, because they did also give us briefings at some point about their communication strategies, about how important optics is to them, because they want to appeal to a more general audience, because they want to seem legitimate and want to brand themselves as something very separate from the old day neo-Nazis. So that was interesting, but also on a very human level to understand better what makes very young people sometimes join these movements. A lot of them didn't really know what they were getting themselves into. And some of them were purely attracted by the entertainment factor, by gamification of propaganda, of recruitment, where it all seemed like a video game. That's become something that I feel like is really dangerous for the next generations, because a lot of the extremist movements are very skillfully exploiting youth cultures, using satire and humor to blur the lines between what's real and what's fiction.
How do you tell the difference, though, between what's merely sort of brooding fantasies from people on the far right versus actual plans? There's always speculation about how these people need to die or how this government has to go and it's illegitimate. How do you tell the difference in your world between the steady stream of complaints and vitriol against established states versus something more like a plot?
It's a very good question. There are, of course, some signs that distinguish merely empty threats from actual credible threats. So in this case, the network had already, for example, organized weapons. They also detected some very specific logistical arrangements that would have signaled that they are getting closer to actually wanting to carry out the plot. So this was not just merely words. This was already turned into the first steps of their plan. And this is usually a warning sign. In terms of socio-psychological factors, I'm actually doing research at Oxford University where I also look at what do, for example, terrorist manifestos have in terms of unique features. What can we learn from them to see what are the signs that someone might actually resort to violence in the real world? What distinguishes them from, for example, merely ideologically extreme political writings. So that's quite interesting because there are several factors that could be seen as almost being part of a formula where that should ring alarm bells in the security services and in the intelligence community. This was clearly a given in this plot.
I wonder what you think about the wisdom of that chasing them, forcing them to hide more deeply, to
burrow into places that are harder to find, harder to see, whether that's really wise. I understand the impulse to try to shut down this speech, to try to discourage this speech. But if you take an 8chan and make them hide better, it's harder to watch what they're up to.
That's definitely true. And some of it has been counterproductive. So, of course, the advantage of the removal of really hateful violence inciting content or even calls to violence was that it would reach a smaller audience. Even if they did migrate to other online platforms, to fringe platforms, that meant they couldn't really take their whole followership to the next platform. But on the other hand, as you say, it's become also more of a challenge for the security services and the intelligence community to monitor what's going on the smaller, more hidden platforms. Many movements have moved to encrypted messaging apps like Telegram and others. And that is definitely a challenge in terms of preventing acts of violence. And also it has caused more grievances that can be used by extremist movements for recruiting more people, because the whole debate about freedom of speech has really turned into a major mobilization issue within the far right. And this is something where I would say that removal policies have had a negative effect on the discourse and have really enabled extremist movements to tap into those newly arising grievances.
Since we last spoke with Julia Ebner, European politics have continued to turn right. On June 9th, far-right parties like the Alternative for Germany and Brothers of Italy scored major victories in Europe's parliament elections. And in France, current President Emmanuel Macron called a special snap election after his party's crushing defeat by Marine Le Pen's National Rally. If French voters decide to dissolve the parliament and give the National Rally a ruling majority in early July, it would shake the entire European Union to its core. Julia might have predicted Europe's surge to the right when she wrote Going Dark in 2018. Her latest book, Going Mainstream: How Extremists Are Taking Over, explores how far-right groups have entered the political limelight. Julia Ebner, welcome back to On Shifting Ground.
Hello, thank you for having me again.
When we last spoke, the Reichsbürgers in Germany had recently been rounded up, charged with a plot to overthrow the German state. In recent elections in Germany, the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, is now seen by many Germans as a real alternative to the parties of government of the last several decades. What would you say the state of play is in Germany?
To be honest, it's been quite alarming to watch the outcomes of the recent European elections, where the AfD was able to achieve the second place in Germany. And they've made a lot of gains in several parts of Germany, where they've also become the strongest party in the regional elections that happened recently. There was actually a scandal just earlier this year where it was uncovered that they had a secret meeting with the new right identitarian movement, which is very much adhering to white nationalist ideologies and is a proponent of the so-called Great Replacement theory, which is similar to the white genocide theory in the US, and basically propagates the idea that white European natives are being gradually replaced by non-whites. So they had this scandal and nonetheless could achieve such high gains and such a win in the recent elections, which shows us that they're right now at the height of their radicalism, but also at the height of their popularity.
Even if you aren't a white identitarian, even if you don't necessarily subscribe to all the tenets of the Great Replacement, if you live in Amsterdam or Rotterdam or Copenhagen or Manchester, you've seen things change in recent decades. Is it that spirit that's giving energy to the right-wing parties across the EU?
It is definitely an important dimension, and parties like the AfD, but also other far-right populist parties in Europe have really tapped into these fears and this uncertainty that big segments of the population are struggling with. And also this fear of relative loss of status, of losing their privileges, but also, fears of migration and the perceived crime that goes hand in hand with migration rates. So the AfD has, even in their propaganda campaigns now, used this idea of Islamization, the Islamization of Europe, and the threat that migrants from Muslim majority countries supposedly pose to Europe. And they've been unfortunately quite successful in running these campaigns that largely build on ideas of existential threat and the utopian state of basically white ethno-nationalism. And you can even see it in the visuals of their campaigns that they play with this idea of the masses of migrants. You can see them. The pictures are very similar to the campaigns that were used by Nigel Farage in the Brexit campaigns of 2016, where also this idea of existential threat was a very powerful narrative.
Those photos are widely circulated here in the United States as well, of famous squares or boulevards in big European cities, thronged with people in hijabs, people wearing kufi hats, sort of physical representations of origins elsewhere, not in Europe. But don't we also have the lived experience? Germany attracted a lot of attention when it took in, 1 million refugees from the Syrian civil war. We know how these people are doing or not doing. Does that inform the way Germans see what's going on? Or is there a dimension in which the reality of how they're acculturating almost doesn't matter? It's just the idea of them that's put out there as a constant threat.
Definitely. I would say that the AfD has managed to manipulate people's opinions also about migrants. Of course, migrants have also been, historically speaking, very useful to the country in economic terms on several levels. There have been studies that showed that Germany wouldn't do so well economically if it hadn't been for the migrant populations that are driving major part of some sectors in the economy. And of course, a lot of the propaganda that has been used by far-right extremist movements and to some extent also by the far-right populist parties draws on half-truths where they do use some of the demographic change statistics, but then they tie it to statistics that are simply not true about migrant crimes and that show distorted rates of these migrant crimes and exacerbate the existing fears. So there is also a sense that they're just very sensationalist and very much tapping into deep emotions and deep identities, deep layers of our identities. So that's also how they get to new population segments and can change their voting behavior.
One of the epicenters of this struggle has been France, and the possibility that right-wing parties are going to do very well in coming elections caused the president, Emmanuel Macron, to call early elections a gamble, a sort of strategic attempt to steal a day's march on his opponents. How should we look at this surprising turn of events in France?
It's a highly risky gamble that Macron is taking here, but it seems like he doesn't have many other options left because his credibility is at stake as well. And of course, he probably assumes or hopes that the relatively low turnout in the European election, it's always a second order election. So there were probably half the population that voted in this election. Whereas usually in the national elections, this voting share would increase. So he's playing the card now because he hopes that he would still win the election, of course. But this is a major gamble. And Marine Le Pen has been very strongly gaining votes and winning in some of the parts of the country that were previously voting for the communist or left-wing parties and have now increasingly turned towards the populist far right.
These are the big countries in Europe that are experiencing this and having to manage it politically. It is an aspect, though perhaps a muted one, of the upcoming British elections as well. Interestingly, at a time when Britain has the first descendant of Asian immigrants as a prime minister, Rishi Sunak, but he is playing a bad hand now after 14 straight years of conservative government. Nigel Farage decided to stay involved after first doing kind of a head fake that he was going to be more involved in the American elections in November and not stand for a seat in parliament or lead his party in the upcoming British general elections. What do you see? You're based in Britain. What do you see going on there?
Yeah, it's been quite interesting to watch because, of course, in recent years, the Conservative Party, the Tories, have shifted further to the right. So they have actually managed to attract some of the voters that would have previously been captured in the UKIP Farage votes in the pre-Brexit era. But now with them using increasingly also the language and kind of catering to people sitting on the very hard right side of the spectrum, they've managed to attract some of the voters there. So it will be interesting to see also how this plays out in the next election. And this, I would say, there are almost two different dynamics at play in Europe in the wider sense, where in some of the countries we see a rise of far-right populist parties that had previously been on the fringes of society. And in other countries, we've just seen a major shift towards the radical right in the centrist parties, like in the UK with the Tory party, even sometimes flirting with some of the conspiracy myths or some of the language that was previously confined to the fringe parties.
Now, the last of the European Big Four to be heard in this conversation is Italy. Now, I wonder whether Italy might be something of a counter case. Some people saw the victory of Giorgia Meloni, started to talk about the sky falling. There was a real strong Cassandra group around the election of a very far-right party in Italian politics as the leader of the coalition. In many ways, hasn't Giorgia Meloni, even in an Italy with low birth rates, with high rates of immigration from the global south, governed as a pretty conventional right-of-center government leader?
Italy is certainly an interesting case, and it does stand out because it's true that when Giorgia Meloni was first voted into power, a lot of the experts would have anticipated that she would have introduced or passed some major far-right anti-migration and paleo-conservative measures that would also push back against LGBTQ rights and so on, which hasn't really played out that way. It is true that she has actually shifted more towards taking a more moderate ground, whereas her rhetoric initially was probably more radical, or at least also the roots of the party of Fratelli d'Italia, Brothers of Italy, are definitely more extreme right or even neo-fascist. So it was a surprise, I think, to many that she would actually be a counter case.
And she's been a good European, and she has supported the NATO project in Ukraine to hold off the Russians. Has this given cover to other right-wing parties in Europe, saying, see, you don't really have anything to be afraid of?
Potentially, although there are, of course, also major rifts within the European far right. And this also will show up now after the elections and how good they are in forming a coalition. For example, there have been splits between also Marine Le Pen in France and the AfD in Germany, because, of course, the AfD in Germany and also, for example, the Freedom Party in Austria and equally also the Freedom Party in the Netherlands, these three parties have certainly been more radical in their ideologies and just more explicit in their language and in the pictures that they've used in the campaigns, where a lot of the campaigns were perceived as deeply racist or at least very radical and very strongly anti-migration. So I would say that Meloni and perhaps also Le Pen have been taking a more subtle approach. And also in terms of their tactics, I do think that there are major divisions within these diverse parties in the European far right.
Well, let's talk about the Netherlands, because Geert Wilders appeared poised to take governing power in the Netherlands. His coalition had attracted the largest share of votes, and he was blocked. And it's hard to know what to make of that. A lot of Dutch voters support right-wing parties at the ballot box, support anti-immigrant measures. Wilders has moved from the real fringy outliers of Dutch politics to something very close to assuming the mantle of power. And Dutch campaigns echo American political tropes about taking back their country, high degrees of concern about non-Dutch people becoming citizens. Is there a danger in denying people like this power that they legitimately won and still keep democratic order?
There's definitely a danger in pushing back against the will of the people. And there's always a danger of leading to counterproductive results if you try to block people who've been voted into power democratically. But of course, there is also a lot of stake for the Netherlands. With Geert Wilders, whose party has run campaigns that were really, for example, also very clearly now in the European elections using visuals of blonde-only families that are playing in the countryside, where these utopian visions of the country do bear some resemblance to some of even the Nazi propaganda campaigns, and certainly today's far-right populist campaigns also used by the Alternative for Germany. So there is a risk, of course, that with someone like Wilders in power, who's also, by the way, referenced the Great Replacement theory, which also motivated the Christchurch attacker in New Zealand to carry out his terrorist attack, and which has, of course, played a major role in radicalization towards violence. Having someone like this in power means that there is a lot at stake as well in the Netherlands. So I do think that there's right now, a very strong polarization happening in the country. For example, also the Farmers' Party, they've also gained ground a lot. They've especially gained a lot of votes since the pandemic. And since some of the environmentally friendly EU measures were introduced that received a massive pushback from the farmers who didn't want to cut down on CO2 emissions or who felt threatened by some of these measures, which of course is also rooted in legitimate concerns and grievances. But there has been a strong anti-establishment and anti-status quo movement in the Netherlands. At the same time, the liberal and more centrist voting population is also very dominant still. So there is an increasing polarization, which is actually similar to what we see in the US, where these two camps are almost irreconcilably opposed to each other.
And both large, so one can't just simply overwhelm the other.
Yeah, exactly. And this is also, I think this is really reflecting a larger phenomenon now. And we've, of course, seen some of these trends already in the US with the pro-Trump and the anti-Trump camps. But we also have similar dynamics now in France with the anti-far right protests that are happening. And even in Germany, where you had major anti-far right protests happening earlier this year. But at the same time, the far right is pushing ahead in a lot of these elections and is becoming stronger. So there is a real sense of an increasingly divided landscape, both in Europe and, of course, in the United States, that's been going on for some time now as well.
I go back and forth on this, so I want to hear you weigh in. You know, there's a tendency in the United States to write trend pieces. So one election happens and everybody slaps themselves on the forehead and says, South America is moving left or Europe is moving right, and making grand pronouncements based on the choices of 10, 12, 15 million people. And so you look at Hungary, and people are rightly concerned about the direction of Hungarian democracy, of Viktor Orban getting chummy with Vladimir Putin in Russia. These are legitimate concerns. But then you have bigger, richer, and in many ways more significant Poland deciding to step back from its rightward trend and elect a government that in effect is closer to the European mainstream. Do we make a mistake if we try to overread or overinterpret one election or another and sort of see grand, big things happening? Or do we ignore those signs at our peril? And we really should pay attention even to the smaller ballots in some of the smaller members of the EU and other international alliances.
It's a really good question. I've also asked myself that question several times. I would say that overall, it is, of course, important to monitor some of the trends. And I do think that we're at a stage where there are alarming signs across Europe, where these rising divisions and the rising polarization, but also this gradual push towards the far right is real. But nonetheless, I do think it's important to be nuanced enough and to look at the cases where actually we see a reversal of some of the effects, as you say, in Poland. But also now, for example, the recent trends in Scandinavian countries like Sweden, for example, didn't really show up in the recent election results in the European elections, where actually the far right didn't make gains in the Scandinavian countries. And in fact, a lot of the countries saw more wins for the centrist parties. So it's also very interesting to looking at these cases, also perhaps to ask ourselves what needs to happen for trends to be reversed, or for perhaps even for some kind of dialogue to happen between the different opposed camps in that polarization dynamic. What's certainly something that I find very interesting, and that is perhaps something that is also just a trend, but is that the younger voting population has been shown to increasingly vote for the far-right populist parties, at least in the German and Austrian context, for example, where there have been some surveys that came out. For example, in Germany, 17% of the young voters voted for the AfD, which is unusually high in the German context, and which also signals that they've actually managed to reach these young audiences, these young voters, especially via TikTok, because they've been the strongest party in terms of launching campaigns on new social media platforms and using reels, using even anime characters. So appealing to that Japanese pop culture element that is interesting and I guess to some extent appealing to especially these younger audiences who use that in their daily references, in their youth cultures or in the online subcultures they're in. So that has been something where perhaps this is just a trend, but it's certainly something to watch out for, I think, in the coming years, because ultimately the next generation's attitudes and behaviors are the ones that really count.
It's tempting to point out that they have no memory of book burnings and pogroms and uniformed right-wing self-appointed militias taking over streets in major cities. They have no memory of people being beaten up on the street because of their origin. If you're a young European, maybe your concerns are more proximate to how you're going to do in life once you get out of school, what looks like the vanishing possibility of enjoying the prosperity that your family did in earlier decades. And that resonates with some of the same things that you hear in American elections. But it's removed from World War II and its aftermath.
Very much so. And now, of course, also even in the educational settings, the witnesses or the people that still witnessed World War II are no longer able to really to feed into the education system. It used to be the case that the German education system is very much tailored towards raising awareness among students about what happened in World War II. But now a lot of the students, and I've seen that in my own undercover investigations, just no longer believe what they're being taught. And that's partly because there are no witnesses or no people anymore who can actually give a first-hand account of what happened. I actually found the campaign that was used by the EU to get young people to vote in the elections really powerful, because they spoke, it was through the lens of grandparents who addressed their children. And these grandparents had witnessed World War II. And I almost cried when I watched this campaign video, which was purely just to motivate young people to go to the voting ballot and put their vote in for the European Union elections. But it was addressed in a way that was felt very personal, because it was, people from different countries who'd witnessed the Holocaust, who'd witnessed World War II, and who appealed to their grandchildren to vote.
You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by Commonwealth Club World Affairs in San Francisco. After the break, Julia Ebner on how extremism has left the dark corners of the web and is now going mainstream in cultures across the West. If you missed any part of this episode or want to catch up on other international stories, download our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. In your last book, Going Dark, you talked about the way that some of these elements in society were burrowing in to countries around the world. In Going Mainstream, in your recent book, you paint a very different picture of the overt, public, high-perch nature of some of these same arguments, the ones that people would make furtively and quietly and on the internet, now becoming part of accepted political discourse. What happened between those two books to change this story so drastically?
It's been really shocking to observe that major shift because I'd been studying extremist movements and going undercover with extremist groups for many years now. And I started 10 years ago when it was all confined to the really dark corners of the internet, or you really had to go looking for these extremist groups. But then it seemed like there was a shift, and all of a sudden symbols, language, and some of the conspiracy myths were really visible in the mainstream discourse and in political discourse as well. And of course, that was a gradual shift, but I would say there was a turning point around the time of the COVID pandemic, where a lot of the conspiracy myths, like even Pizzagate, which was transformed into QAnon and tied to the pandemic, really gained ground massively during that time and were exported to Europe as well. So I initially joined QAnon groups in 2017 when they just had a few thousand followers, mainly in the US, and they were really focused on the US, but very fringe. And then I saw them grow over time. And with the pandemic, they multiplied. And it was incredible to watch how many people got sucked into these conspiracy myths and suddenly started to really have these very strong anti-establishment views, but also anti-science, anti-minority, anti-LGBTQ. It often came together, and there was a lot of crossover between the far-right extremist networks and the conspiracy myth networks that could expand their reach in the time of the pandemic. So I would say that this landscape of overlapping crises that we've witnessed in the last few years, that played a major role in the expansion of far-right networks and in that mainstreaming effect, because people did feel real grievances and real fears related to these crises, which really touched their identities, which touched them on a deeply emotional level. So not just the health crisis of COVID-19, but also related to that, of course, the economic and living cost crisis and the inflation crisis, which is particularly strong here in Europe right now. And also the conflicts, the Russian aggression war in Ukraine, as well as the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. That's really been something that has been instrumentalized by a lot of these groups, but where they could tap into real fears and uncertainty about the future of many people.
You know, epidemiologists and virologists speculate about the way different pathogens trade DNA to become more muted in their effect or to become more virulent or more contagious in their effect. And it was fascinating to watch the way the pre-existing stories about a dark cabal of rich, connected people scattered around the world, drinking the blood of tortured children in order to maintain youth and vitality, traded DNA with stories about the development of the COVID-19 vaccine. So there was this interesting, they entered into a similar slipstream and began to be adopted by similar groups. And now they echo each other. The people who were very wired up about the rapid development of the COVID-19 vaccine have borrowed some of the DNA of the Comet Pizza restaurant and the torture and trading of children, their adrenalized blood being consumed by people. This is stuff that if you had heard during another era, you would just say, oh, that's silly. That's not happening. There are now, I mean, you know better than I, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people who believe aspects. Maybe they don't believe every part of it. They'll even say, oh, I don't know about that part of it. But, and then they turn around and repeat word for word QAnon talking points. This has been, I think you're right about the pandemic supercharging this. But where does it go from here? It seems to be grabbing other aspects of other right-wing causes and becoming this thing, this entity, this grab bag of beliefs about how the world works.
Yeah. It's interesting that you compare it to the virus, because it's been called an infodemic even by the WHO. And to some extent, disinformation was spreading faster than the virus itself. And indeed, I would also say that these conspiracy myths did mutate. And over time, of course, there's still a core to the hard believers that really believe in the very, very extreme expressions of QAnon and the conspiracy myths surrounding it. But it also, with the increasing contagiousness of that conspiracy myth, a bit like with viruses, where then the lethality decreases, the radicalism also decreased a little bit. But it also meant that it became much more contagious, and it was tied to people's fears about the vaccines. And not everyone would, of course, believe that everyone in Buckingham Palace is a reptile or that the elites are drinking the blood of young children. But even to some extent, even these narratives have definitely entered the more mainstream discussions. And even if not everyone believes in the very radical ideas attached to QAnon, there is a sense that the conspiracy myth has been able to attract millions of followers.
Has the internet, and not only the internet, but the increasing universality of English, have they worked in tandem to spread these ideas to places where perhaps they wouldn't have found any pickup? They wouldn't have gotten much credence before. Has the American domination of the web, with the greater penetration of the web and the increasing ubiquity of English, all had a part in contributing to the way these ideas spread around the world?
Absolutely, because looking back at history, for example, even in times of the plague in the 14th century or in times of the cholera, conspiracy myths did spread. And also there was a sense of anti-minority resentment rising in those times. For example, during times of the plague, the conspiracy myth that Jews had poisoned the wells was circulated. Or in times of the cholera, this idea spread that doctors were just trying to harvest organs, and that's why they created cholera. So there is a sense that crisis can give rise to conspiracy myths. But it's never spread on such an international level and at this speed as it is happening today. And that is due to the new technologies enabling that, to the internet and social media, but also, as you say, because people all speak English. So it's been really easy, for example, for QAnon to create offshoots in the Netherlands. I even saw how one of the users that was in one of the original English language groups said, "Oh, I have ties to the Netherlands. I want to start QAnon in the Netherlands." And it ended up becoming a huge movement there as well. And of course, the same is true for the German-speaking world, where they use very similar language. And you could even see parallels in the Capitol riots that happened in the US. A few months before January 6th, you had this attempt to storm the German Reichstag with very similar logos and very similar references, conspiracy myth references and words being used. There were even pro-Trump slogans to be seen on those banners, which is just weird in the German context. But it also stems from that idea that now a lot of the Germans just go into the English language channels because they find a lot of like-minded people there, and they adopt the same ideologies and tailor them to the local context, but it's still the same essence.
So who's watching who? Who's taking cues from who? Or is this really a kind of interdependence of the spread, of the reach of both right-wing politics and of disinformation?
There is a cross-pollination between the American and the European far right and new right. But very often, for example, the new right in Europe is copying the tactics of the American alt-right. And they've adopted very similar social media strategies. This whole idea of gamifying their communication, using memes, that was originally from the US alt-right. And the new right in Europe has adopted that very successfully. And even the far-right populist parties in Europe have mirrored some of the campaign tactics that have been used by the pro-Trump campaigns. And so it was interesting to see. I do think there is also an element of the other way around. There was more of an intellectual inspiration of the European new right or the European identitarians. They first had this idea of the Great Replacement, which then in the US was coined as the white genocide idea. But there were a lot of elements that were taken from this European intellectual backbone of the far right or of the new right and were taken into an American context. So there is a cross-pollination. But nonetheless, very often, I think we first see some of the trends arise in the US. And it's very helpful for experts like myself who focus on both continents, but can first see some of the dynamics play out in the US and then almost anticipate what is going to happen next in Europe in terms of tactics and trends.
I think a good example of what you're describing is the French dystopian novel Camp of the Saints, which an American anti-immigrant foundation funder paid for to be translated into English. And then various tribunes of the new right, like Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller, continued to endorse Camp of the Saints and tell English language readers to pick up a copy, to read it. It's a gruesome story of an invasion of North America and Europe by hordes of people coming from the global south, led by an Indian. And they basically take over the wealth and the political influence of what we used to call the First World, just through sheer force of numbers and invasion. And it is a disgusting, horrifying group, a group of stories. Yet, now it's like it's an English language novel. Now it circulates in English all over the world.
Yeah, that's a good example. And an example of the other way around of the alt-right exporting some of the tactics, the social media tactics to the European new right, is there were quite a few trolling armies, far-right trolling armies that were formed to influence European elections and that used a lot of the same language that the alt-right used and also the same memes. They even had a meme database which largely built on American memes and they just adopted them and repurposed them for the European context. So it was definitely interesting to see that mutual inspiration.
So is Le Pen a Giorgia Meloni in waiting or a Viktor Orban in waiting? Is there even any way to know?
It's really hard to know, and let's see what the snap elections outcome will be. But it is, of course, always possible for far-right populist politicians like Marine Le Pen to create a completely different state, to put at risk all the democratic institutions, the media institutions, and even science, like we see in the context of Orban's Hungary. And it's not only is there no neutral media institution anymore, it's also they've also kicked out the Central European University. And it has really led to major changes in the country that have a bigger impact on the whole of Europe. So that's always a risk that we don't see another Meloni, but we see another Orban in any of these countries that have upcoming elections. The same is true for Austria, where the far-right populist party, Freedom Party, the FPÖ, they already have made promises to basically close down the official media agencies that are currently dominating the Austrian media landscape.
But it's interesting in France that in the face of the snap elections and in the face of the possibility of right-wing parties doing much better, the French left hasn't been asleep. They actually had a strategic nationwide meeting to bring in all the elements and say, okay, here's the challenge. What are we going to do to maximize our chances? So there is at least a fair fight going on, right?
Yeah, that's also what I meant about the highly polarized landscape. There is a fight, but it also means that the fight might just become even uglier in the run-up to the snap election and also in what we see in the aftermath, because high polarization rates are never a good sign of a healthy country or politically healthy country. I think that can also lead to a lot of societal tensions and political tensions.
What should we watch through the rest of 2024? A critical year where a big chunk of humanity is or just has headed to the polling booths. What are you looking for?
I'm mostly looking at the younger generations because I do think, they can be a sign of hope that perhaps in the future there might be something that could really significantly decrease polarization from happening. And we might just see opportunities to help reverse some of the effects of the political decisions that are being taken now. But also they will just play the biggest role in changing the dynamics in the coming years. The people who are now starting to be eligible for voting, I think will have a major impact in not only this year's elections, but also the future dynamics where we see they are shifting the entire landscape. And yeah, I think that's something, looking at the attitudes and the trends among the youngest voting populations is something that I find the most interesting.
Will you also watch not just the results, but the campaigns? Is what people say and how they say it as important in its way as the outcomes?
I'm monitoring the campaigns of the different parties. And of course, even just the campaigns can also have a radicalizing effect or a polarizing effect, but they hardly ever do the opposite. But I do look at the different ways in which also election campaigns are trying to manipulate voters into a certain direction. Of course, it's all about producing change in behaviors and change in attitudes. So there is a lot of manipulation in any campaign, really. But they are using new tactics. And one of the elements that we're also paying close attention to at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, where I'm also affiliated with, are election manipulation campaigns that tap into the newest technologies, into AI, into deepfakes, or into even perhaps some of the large language models like ChatGPT, to some extent to influence people's voting behaviors or people's attitudes on a larger scale. So I think that will also be something worth monitoring. And lastly, I'm also doing a project at the moment at the University of Oxford, which looks at psychological patterns that show up in language of leaders and heads of state who've in the past used extreme forms of violence, either against their own populations or against other countries' populations, like genocides, wars of aggression, or large-scale mass killings. And the idea is to find patterns so that we can also, when we look at modern day leaders or campaigns, that we can spot the warning signs early enough to say, well, there's a big risk that this leader or this party might in the future engage in some large scale violence. And of course, it's not about predicting who exactly it will be, but it's all about risk. And there are certainly some psychological risk factors that have been studied in the past. And we're trying to right now, complement existing analysis.
Julia Ebner is the author of Going Mainstream: How Extremists Are Taking Over. She leads the Violent Extremism Lab at the University of Oxford. Great to talk to you again, Julia. Thanks for joining us.
Great to speak to you. Thank you for having me.
As we wrap today's program, I want to tell you about a project I've been working on for the last couple of years. Because the themes of this far-right swing have implications for the U.S. immigration system, and the border issues will likely drive the 2024 presidential election.
Baghdad on the subway. That's what O. Henry called New York, the town where East meets West amidst the babble of 100 tongues.
The United States is a nation of immigrants, rarely more than now. In recent decades, the numbers have skyrocketed thanks to people coming from many places, especially in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Just like their predecessors, new arrivals face countless obstacles, including political hatred. And yet, like their predecessors, they work hard, they persist, they become us. The newest Americans are poorly understood and frequently presented only in stereotype. I know this because I've crisscrossed the country to speak to new Americans from all corners of the globe and record their stories. This portrait of our newest citizens is full of their own compelling voices. It's a story as old as the country, yet each new wave of arrivals tells that classic story in new and crucially challenging ways. Here's an excerpt from my new book, We Are Home: Becoming American in the 21st Century. In recent years, gunmen have headed to shopping centers in El Paso, Texas, and Buffalo, New York, to shoot up stores where Black and Latino shoppers gather. Other gunmen headed to a synagogue in Pittsburgh and a Black church in Charleston, enraged in various ways by the way they think America is changing. In 2017, a torchlit parade snaked through Thomas Jefferson's hometown of Charlottesville, Virginia, to rally around a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee and chant, "You will not replace us." The idea that dark forces are engineering demographic change in the United States to the detriment of whites of European origin by encouraging high rates of immigration to shift the balance of political power in the U.S., has moved from the fringes of American ideological battles to somewhere much closer to the emotional center. The messaging in the America First Declaration of Principles and night after night in conservative media outlets is loud and clear. These new people aren't like us. The messages confidently assert that newer arrivals are changing the country you thought you knew in ways you don't like. And perhaps worst of all, the new people won't pull their weight. And when that happens, who'll have to support them? You. We simply can't take any more striving, struggling, ambitious, hardworking people, especially if they aren't like us already. That idea turned out to be wrong in 1871. It turned out to be wrong half a century later in 1921, when the nativists were rewriting immigration law. And it's wrong today. Immigrants to America have always faced resistance and have always, over time, assimilated and become vital parts of America. They join our communities. Their children speak flawless American English. They intermarry. This is a process as old as the nation itself, and it can't be stopped, no matter how many or how few new immigrants arrive every year. What does it mean to be us? Is it strictly a geographical designation? A product of birthplace? Is it a feeling, or something more like a legal arrangement? When we draw lines around places and call them borders, would we also say everybody inside the line is us, and everybody on the other side, them? On Tuesday, July 9th at 6 p.m. Pacific Time, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Jose Antonio Vargas, founder and president of Define American, and veteran journalist Shireen Marisol Miraji, assistant professor at UC Berkeley's School of Journalism, will join me on stage to talk about what I learned while reporting and writing my new book, and we'll have a conversation about the state of immigration in the U.S. and how the issue will have an impact on the 2024 presidential and congressional elections. You can buy tickets online at commonwealthclub.org, and please join us in person or online and be part of the conversation. You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced, mixed, and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.